My name is Nora Ellen Whitfield. I am 37 years old. And the night my stepmother asked me why I was being so quiet at dinner, I had spent the previous 4 hours reading a handwritten ledger that proved she had been collecting money in my dead grandmother's name for 11 years. I did not answer her question right away. I picked up my water glass, I set it back down. I looked at the centerpiece she had arranged on the table, a little bundle of dried eucalyptus tied with twine and placed in a mason jar because that was the kind of thing Cheryl did. Small, careful decorations that said I belong here, this is my home, this table is mine, and I thought tomorrow, not yet tomorrow. That ledger is sitting on my kitchen counter right now. I moved it there this morning from the dining room table where I had left it last night after I finally finished reading. It is a pale green composition notebook, the kind you can find at any dollar store with a black spine and a small oval label on the front where someone has written in my grandmother's handwriting the word household. She always labeled things, her measuring cups, her cassette tapes, the shelves in her pantry. Her mason jars in the cellar. She wrote in a small, upright printed hand that never changed from the time she was 30 until she died at 81, and I would recognize that handwriting anywhere. I have been recognizing it my whole life. But the entries inside the notebook are not in my grandmother's handwriting, they are in Cheryl's. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. This is where we share real-life inspired tales of family conflict, betrayal, and the quiet strength it takes to stand your ground. If these stories speak to you, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. I want to tell you how I found it, but to tell you how I found it, I have to tell you about the storage unit, and to tell you about the storage unit, I have to tell you about my grandmother, and to tell you about my grandmother, I have to go back much further than the notebook. I have to go back to the summer I was 9 years old, standing in her kitchen on Elm Ridge Road in Youngstown, Ohio, watching her press a piece of masking tape that said peaches onto a mason jar with her thumb. Her name was Lorraine Ida Whitfield née Prater. She was born in 1941 in a two-room house outside Steubenville, and she moved to Youngstown when she was 19 to marry my grandfather Carl, who worked at the Republic Steel plant on the south side of town and who died of a heart attack at 53 when I was 2 years old. I do not remember him. I know him only through the photographs she kept on the shelf above her television and through the things she said about him, which were not many and were always the same. He was a good man, he was tired. He did not deserve to go so soon. My grandmother raised my father alone after Carl died, and she did it on a home health aide salary and a small survivor pension, and whatever she could put aside from the garden she kept in the backyard, which was enormous, nearly a quarter of the lot, and which produced more tomatoes and green beans and summer squash than she could ever eat alone. She gave the rest away to the neighbors and to the church on Hazel Street and sometimes to the food pantry on Manning Avenue on the first and third Tuesdays of the month. She was not a woman who talked about money. She did not complain about having little, and she did not celebrate when she had more. She kept going. That was her whole approach to the world as far as I could tell. You keep going, you label things so you can find them later. You put something away for the people who come after you. I have thought about that last one a great deal in the past 8 months. I am a forensic bookkeeper. I have been doing this work for 12 years, first with a regional accounting firm in Columbus called Mast and Hendry, and then on my own, freelance, which is how I have been operating for the last 6 years out of a home office in Akron. I reconstruct financial records for estates, for businesses that have been mismanaged, for families in the middle of legal disputes who need someone to sit down with a box of receipts and a decade of bank statements and make sense of what happened. I am good at this work. I am patient and I am precise and I am very hard to rattle, which is a quality I developed slowly, across many years and many difficult rooms, and that I am grateful for every single time I sit across from someone who is counting on that stillness. I say this because I want you to understand who I am before I tell you what I found. I am not a woman who makes accusations lightly. I have spent my professional life learning the difference between a mistake and a decision, between carelessness and intent, and I know that difference in my bones. What I found in that pale green notebook was not a mistake. My father married Cheryl in June of 2004. I was 17. I remember sitting across from her at my grandmother's kitchen table at the Sunday dinner where she was first introduced, watching her eat my grandmother's pot roast and compliment it twice. That second compliment sat wrong with me in a way I could not have named at 17. It was one too many, like someone who had rehearsed being grateful. She helped clear the dishes afterward without being asked, which my grandmother noticed and mentioned later after they had gone. She seemed nice, my grandmother said. She pays attention. My grandmother was right about that. Cheryl has always paid very close attention. The trouble is what she does with what she notices. They were married at the courthouse on a Thursday afternoon in June with about 12 people present and lunch after at the Antlers restaurant on Belmont Avenue. My grandmother came. I was my father's witness. Cheryl's younger sister Denise was hers. Afterward, everyone went back to my grandmother's house because it was the largest and because my grandmother had made two pies and a pasta salad and because in our family that was simply what you did. You went to Lorraine's. You sat on her covered porch. You watched the evening come in over the Prater Street rooftops and talked about nothing until it was time to leave. Cheryl moved into my father's apartment on the north side after the wedding. She did not move into my grandmother's house. I want to be very clear about that because the timeline matters. She was nearby, she visited often, she called on Sundays, but she was not there. My grandmother lived alone on Elm Ridge Road from the time my father moved out in 1987 until October of 2011, when she fell in the backyard on a Saturday morning and broke her wrist and her hip, and my father decided she could not be alone anymore. That was when the arrangement began. My father would stay 3 nights a week and Cheryl would be there the rest of the time. That was how it was explained to me over the phone that November. I was 25, I had been with the firm in Columbus for 2 years, I called my grandmother every Sunday without fail, I visited at Christmas and for several days in the summer. I sent birthday cards, I was not there in the ways that counted, and I have turned that over many times in the months since I found the notebook. I was not there. My grandmother died in March of 2016 at 81 in the hospital on a Monday morning. My father was with her. Cheryl was in the waiting room. I was on a plane from Columbus that landed 40 minutes after she was gone. I took a cab from the airport and walked down a hallway that smelled like floor cleaner and old coffee, and I sat in a plastic chair next to my father, and he put his arm around me, and neither of us said anything for a long time. Cheryl brought us both coffee from the vending machine on that floor. She organized everything that followed with a competence and steadiness that I was grateful for at the time and that I have thought about differently since. The funeral home, the obituary, the reception at the Elm Ridge house, which she arranged with her sister Denise and 3 women from my grandmother's church, the casserole dishes and the folding chairs and the parking and the flowers, all of it appropriate, all of it handled. I was grieving and tired, and I had a return flight booked for the following Sunday, and I let Cheryl manage it because she was there and I was not. The house on Elm Ridge Road went to my father. That was what the will said. My grandmother had made it in 2008 with an attorney and boardman named Dennis Cullen, and she had left the house to her only child, my father, with a note attached that said she hoped he would take care of it the way she had. She left me her sewing cabinet, which I still have in my spare bedroom, and a savings account that the estate attorney told me contained $9,400, which I put toward my student loans. There was no other estate to speak of, he said. My grandmother had not been wealthy. She had the house valued at roughly $80,000 in 2016 and the savings account and her personal belongings. That was all. Except that was not all, I know that now. My father sold the Elm Ridge house in 2019. He and Cheryl had been in their own home in Boardman for several years by then, and the Elm Ridge house was sitting empty, and the upkeep was becoming more than he wanted to manage. He got $112,000 for it. I did not object. It was not my house. I asked if there was anything inside I should come and collect before the sale closed, and Cheryl told me she had already gone through everything, that she had donated what was still usable and disposed of the rest, and that there was nothing left. I would want to. I said thank you, I believed her. I moved back to Akron in January of 2020, which put me closer to my father than I had been in 15 years. We started having dinner together once a month, sometimes more. Cheryl cooked, usually something simple, a soup or a roasted chicken, and we sat at their table on Glenwood Drive and talked the way families do when the deeper things are too complicated to bring up directly. My father's health had not been good since a cardiac event in 2018, and he tired easily and he did not like to discuss it. Cheryl managed his medications and his appointments and his diet with the same quiet efficiency she had always brought to everything, and I watched her and I was grateful because I was not there in the ways that mattered and she was. It was in January of 2023 that my father mentioned the storage unit. We were at dinner. He said it the way you mention something small, the way you would mention a piece of mail that had arrived addressed to someone else. We were talking about something completely unrelated, a magazine subscription or a neighbor's dog, and he said, "Oh, I should ask you about your grandmother's storage unit on Meridian Road. Do you know anything about that?" And I said no, I did not know she had a storage unit. And he said he had received a renewal notice in the mail and her name was still on the lease, and he was not sure what to do about it. Cheryl was in the kitchen. I heard something set down on the counter, a cup or a glass placed down on a hard surface with a small, deliberate sound. I said, "Send me the notice." My father said he would. He never did. I did not push it. I have thought about that many times since. I did not push it because I was busy, because the storage unit seemed minor, because Cheryl came back from the kitchen at that moment with a plate of cookies and the conversation shifted, and by the time I was in my car driving home, the whole thing had half slipped from my mind. I was working on 3 cases that month. I was tired. I let it go. 14 months later, in March of 2024, I was working on an estate case for a family in Medina County. The case involved an elderly woman whose daughter had been managing her finances for 5 years before she died and had done a very poor job of separating her mother's money from her own. Whether it was careless or deliberate was not my question to answer. My job was to reconstruct the records and present the figures. But something in the pattern of one account, something in the way the deposits and withdrawals had been arranged over several years, sat wrong with me, the way things sit wrong when you have looked at financial records long enough that your eye starts to catch discrepancies before your brain names them. I went home that evening and I thought about my grandmother's savings account, the $9,400. I had taken the estate attorney's word for it in 2016 because I was 29 and grieving and had no reason not to. I had never pulled the actual bank records myself. I had never looked at the account history. It took me 3 phone calls over 2 days to track down the correct institution because the bank my grandmother had used had been absorbed twice over. When I finally reached someone in their records department, a woman named Patricia who was methodical and patient, I gave my grandmother's name and social security number and asked what she could tell me. The account had not had $9,400 in it when my grandmother died in March of 2016. It had had $9,400 in it in October of 2013. At that time, Cheryl had opened a linked joint access authorization on the account. Between October of 2013 and March of 2016, the balance had moved around. It had gone up and come down and gone up again. In March of 2016, it had had $14,260 in it. The $9,400 that had been documented in the estate and transferred to me had been a separate withdrawal, made in February of 2016, 3 weeks before my grandmother died, at a time when my grandmother was in the hospital and not able to manage her own finances. I sat with that at my kitchen table for a long time. My coffee had gone cold. Outside the window, a cardinal was moving through the bare forsythia bush by the fence, checking each branch in turn, and I watched it and I thought, all right, now you look. Patricia sent me what she was legally able to release. The documents she could not release directly, she explained how to request formally, and I did, and it took 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, I also located the storage unit. I called Sure Store on Meridian Road. It is a low, beige building behind a gas station, one of those places you drive past without registering. The woman I spoke to was named Kim. She pulled up the account. She confirmed that a storage unit had been leased in my grandmother's name since 2009, auto-renewing annually on a credit card that had been updated most recently in 2021. My grandmother had been dead since 2016. The credit card that was maintaining the lease was not one I had ever seen in the estate records. Kim gave me the last 4 digits. I wrote them in my notebook. It took me 3 more weeks to establish the legal standing to access the unit. I will not walk you through all of those steps because they are administrative and they are not where the story lives. The story lives in what was inside. The unit was a 10 by 10 climate controlled. It held 14 boxes, cardboard banker's boxes, all neatly stacked in 2 rows with their lids taped down. On each box, in my grandmother's small upright print, a single word written in black ink: kitchen, linens, books, photos, Carl sewing, papers, garden, church, ornaments, summer tools, misc, and the last one, household. I stood in the doorway of that unit for a while before I went in. It was a Wednesday morning in April, and the light inside was the flat, pale yellow of fluorescent bulbs, and the air smelled like cardboard and old fabric and something faintly floral that I traced eventually to a sachet of dried lavender my grandmother had tucked into the corner of the box marked linens. I knew that sachet. She kept them in her dresser drawers and between her winter sweaters and in the linen closet on the second floor. I had not smelled that particular combination of dried flowers and old cotton in 8 years, and I was not prepared for what it did to me. Something dropped down through my chest and stayed there for several minutes before I could draw a full breath. I started with the papers. Inside, I found what you would expect: her marriage certificate, Carl's death certificate, her birth certificate and her parents' marriage certificate, and a folder of things going back even further, documents from her own childhood that I had never seen. The original deed to the Elm Ridge house from 1969 paid in full $31,000, both their names on it, a folder of expired insurance policies, her social security card in a small envelope with her name written on the outside, old tax returns going back to 1978, and an envelope of photographs, black and white, people I mostly did not recognize, relatives from her parents' generation, and one photograph of a young woman in front of a car who I eventually decided was my grandmother herself at maybe 20 years old, laughing at something outside the frame. I held that photograph for a long time. She looked so easy, so unguarded. I did not often see her that way, even in memory. She was a contained woman, my grandmother, private. She kept her interior life somewhere you could sense but not quite reach. I propped the photograph against the side of the box and went back to work. I went through every box that morning. I did not open them all fully, just lifted the lids and surveyed, looking for anything that did not belong, anything that would tell me why these 14 boxes had been sitting in a storage unit on Meridian Road for up to 15 years with nobody knowing they were there. Most of what I found was exactly what the labels said. Kitchen things, linens, books, mostly paperbacks, and a few hardcovers from the library sales she liked to attend. Ornaments wrapped in newspaper, tools from the garage, her sewing box with the needle packets still organized by size the way she had always kept them. The box labeled Carl held his things, his watch, his wallet empty, the leather worn soft, his service medals from Korea in a small case lined with blue velvet, a stack of letters he had written to her from overseas tied with kitchen twine, the paper so old it had gone translucent at the folds. I did not read them. I put the lid back on that box carefully. The last box I opened was household. On top of a stack of old utility bills and grocery receipts, and a folder of appliance manuals for things she had not owned in 20 years, there was a pale green composition notebook with a black spine and a small oval label on the cover in her handwriting that said household. I opened it standing in the storage unit with the fluorescent light above me and the smell of dried lavender still in the air. The first entry was dated January 2009, and it was not in my grandmother's handwriting. I drove home with the notebook in the passenger seat. All 14 boxes were in the back of my car, which I had cleared out that morning before I left, knowing I was going to need the space. I drove back up Meridian Road and down Manning Avenue and turned onto my street and sat in the driveway for a few minutes before I went inside. The cardinal that lives in the forsythia was on the fence post. He looked at me, I looked back at him. I made tea, I sat down at the kitchen table. I opened the notebook to the first page and I began to read. The first entry said, Lorraine Household Fund started this to keep track. Below that in Cheryl's small, left slanting handwriting, a date and a dollar amount and a description, groceries. The next line, another date, another amount, utilities, prescriptions, car insurance. The amounts were modest in those first months, the kind of thing you might record if you were managing someone else's household budget and wanted to show your work. Then in April of 2009, a new line appeared. The description was one word, transfer. Below it, a dollar amount and a partial account number, just the last 4 digits, different from any account I had seen in my grandmother's records. I did not move from that table for 4 hours. The ledger ran from January 2009 through December 2019. 11 years. The household expenses were recorded in the left-hand column, dated and described, the groceries and utilities and prescriptions and occasional car repairs. And then woven through them at irregular intervals, sometimes once a month and sometimes more, and occasionally not at all for several months at a stretch, the transfers, just that one word, a dollar amount, and those 4 digits. The amounts varied. Some months it was $200, some months it was $600. A handful of times in a given year it would be more, $1,200, $1,500, at points that I would later be able to connect to dates when my grandmother had received a larger pension disbursement or a tax refund. Cheryl had not been careless about this. She had not taken so much that it would be obvious. She had taken what could be explained, what could be absorbed into the natural fluctuation of an elderly woman's finances without raising a flag. I sat back in my chair when I reached the last page and I looked at my hands for a moment. They were completely still. That is something I have learned to notice about myself, that when I am most disturbed my hands go very quiet, as if they are waiting for the rest of me to catch up with what I know. The total was somewhere between $60,000 and $70,000 on a first accounting. I would need the full bank records to be precise. I would get them, but sitting there in my kitchen at 11 o'clock at night with the tea cold in the mug and the refrigerator humming its low hum, I knew what I was looking at. I had been looking at versions of it for 12 years. This was not carelessness. This was not confusion. This was recorded, deliberate, maintained across 11 years in a notebook kept in a storage unit paid for with a credit card that should not have existed after March of 2016. I have thought a great deal about why she kept it, why she kept the notebook, why she kept paying the storage unit, why she did not destroy the evidence when she had every opportunity to do so. The most honest answer I have found is that she did not think anyone would ever look. The unit was in my grandmother's name. My father did not know about it or had forgotten the renewal notice and never followed up. No one had reason to go looking. And Cheryl had always managed these things, always been the one who organized, who paid attention, who handled what needed handling. It may not have occurred to her that the handling itself could become the evidence. Or it may be that she was proud of the record, that the careful columns and the consistent handwriting and the 11 years of precise accounting represented something she valued about herself, some private documentation of the attention she had paid, the work she had done, the system she had maintained. I cannot get all the way into that. I have tried and I cannot get there. I closed the notebook. I set it on the kitchen table. Outside, a car went slowly down my street. A dog somewhere barked twice and stopped. I thought about my grandmother at 20 years old, laughing at something outside the frame of a photograph I had never seen before today. I thought about the pot of soup my grandmother used to make in the blue enamel pot that Cheryl now uses at her dinner table on Glenwood Drive. I thought about Cheryl at the hospital with 2 cups of vending machine coffee and the way she had said, gently and without any cruelty that I could see, that there was nothing left in the house I would want. I thought she has been sitting across from me at this table for 20 years. I thought tomorrow you make the calls. I went to bed at 1 in the morning and I lay there in the dark and I thought about my grandmother labeling things. The measuring cups, the mason jars, the cassette tapes, the shelves in the pantry, each one with a piece of masking tape and a word in black ink, and then the box labeled household. Her handwriting on the outside, someone else's handwriting on the inside. My grandmother had lived with Cheryl in that house for 4 years before she died. 4 years is a long time to live with someone. You see things in 4 years, you notice things, you understand eventually the shape of what is happening around you, even if you cannot name it, even if you have no way to stop it or to prove it. My grandmother was a woman who labeled things so that people could find them later. She labeled the notebook. She did not destroy it or move it or tell anyone about it. She left it where it could be found. I have thought about what that means. I think it means she knew. In the morning, I called Janet Kowalski. She's an estate attorney in Akron with an office on Portage Path, a practical woman in her late 50s with short gray hair and reading glasses she keeps on a chain around her neck, and I had worked with her on 2 professional matters and trusted her precision. I told her I had found a document that I believed constituted evidence of financial elder abuse and possible fraud, and I asked if she had time to meet. She said 2 o'clock. I brought the notebook, I brought the storage unit records, I brought the bank documentation Patricia had sent. I laid it on Janet's conference table in the order I had found it and I walked her through it while she listened without interrupting, her yellow legal pad in front of her and her pen still capped in her hand. When I finished, she uncapped the pen and wrote 3 things. Then she said, "You are going to need the full bank records." I said, "I know." She said, "And the credit card statements for the account that was paying the storage unit." I said, "I know." She said, "And a forensic accounting of the transfers done by someone other than you." I said, "I understand." She said, "Because you are the interested party here." I said, "Yes." She looked at the notebook for a moment. Then she looked at me. She said, "You understand that if this is what it appears to be, we are talking about elder financial abuse under Ohio Revised Code 2937, which is a felony, and potentially wire fraud if the transfers cross certain thresholds." I said, "Yes, I understood." She said, "And your father is married to this woman." I said, "Yes." She wrote something else on the legal pad, then she said, "All right, let's figure out how to do this carefully." The bank records took 6 weeks to come through completely. In those 6 weeks, I continued going to dinner at my father and Cheryl's house because to stop going would have changed something in the atmosphere that I could not afford to change. I went once in April and once in May. I ate Cheryl's food. I listened to my father talk about the neighbor's dog and the documentary he had watched and the back pain that had been troubling him since February. I watched Cheryl refill his water glass. I watched her clear the dishes and cover the leftovers and put the kettle on for his evening tea. I was exactly as present and as unremarkable as I had always been, and when she looked at me across the table, I looked back and said whatever was appropriate to say. I do not know if she suspected anything during those weeks. I have gone back over both dinners in my mind many times, looking for a sign, and I cannot find one. She was warm and efficient and attentive the way she has always been, and if she watched me a little more closely than usual, I cannot say with confidence whether that was real or something I am projecting backward onto the memory. The bank records came in late May. A package of documents from the institution Patricia had referred me to and from two additional institutions that had held joint or linked accounts in my grandmother's name. I sat at my kitchen table on a Saturday morning with all of it spread out, and I went through it the way I go through everything, page by page, building a spreadsheet as I went, the dates and the amounts and the account numbers all going into their proper columns. It took most of the day. By early evening I had a number. The total across all accounts, across all 11 years, accounting for every transfer to the account with those last four digits, was $83,412. Not 60 to 70,000, $83,412. I sat with that number for a long time. I did not move from the table. The light outside changed from afternoon to evening, and I did not turn on the kitchen light, and for a while I was sitting in the near dark with the spreadsheet in front of me and the notebook beside it and all 14 of my grandmother's labeled boxes in the spare bedroom down the hall. $83,412. 11 years. From a woman who had paid off her house in 17 years on a home health aide salary, from a woman who gave her surplus tomatoes to the food pantry, from a woman who bought Bic ballpoints in multi-packs at the dollar store and used them until they ran dry. I ate something eventually, I cannot remember what, and I called Janet and left a voicemail with the number and went to bed. The following Thursday, Janet and I met with the forensic accounting firm she had retained for verification. They are a small firm in Cleveland called Hargrove Associates, and the woman who handled our case was named Diane, and she was exactly the kind of person you want in that room: careful, neutral, thorough, without any particular interest in either confirming or disputing what I had found. She needed 2 weeks with the documents. She came back with a figure of $83,620, which was slightly higher than mine because she had caught 3 transfers I had not, all small, all from 2011, the first year of the arrangement, all to the same account. The account we had determined by then belonged to a name I did not recognize, not Cheryl, not Cheryl's sister Denise, not any name in my grandmother's circle. The name on the account was a woman named Patricia Ann Dunmore of Austintown, Ohio, which I want to tell you means nothing in itself. A name in an account is not evidence of anything on its own. But when Janet ran it through her channels, what she found was that Patricia Ann Dunmore had been Cheryl's college roommate at Youngstown State in the early 1980s, and that her phone number was in Cheryl's contact list, and that she had died in 2020. Which was why the account had no activity after December of 2019. That was when Cheryl had stopped keeping the ledger. When the account holder died, the arrangement ended. And then the storage unit continued on autopilot, renewing annually on a credit card connected to nothing anyone was looking at, until a renewal notice came to my father's house in January of 2023, and he mentioned it at dinner without knowing what he was saying. I have thought about how close I came to not finding any of it. I think about this more than I should, probably, if he had not mentioned it. If I had not been working the Medina County case that spring and felt the particular wrongness in that pattern of deposits, if Patricia at the bank had been less thorough or less willing or had told me the records were not available, if the storage unit had been under a different name, or if Kim at Sure Store had been having a different kind of day and had not pulled up the account with the patience she did. Any of those things, and the notebook stays in that box on that shelf in that unit, renewing annually on a dead woman's credit card until eventually something administrative catches it and the contents are disposed of. But that is not what happened. What happened is that my grandmother labeled a box. She put her handwriting on the outside of a pale green composition notebook, and she put it in a unit she had been paying for since 2009, and she left it in a place where, if anyone ever came looking, they would find it. The dinner I told you about at the beginning, where Cheryl asked me why I was being so quiet, was 3 weeks ago. It was early June. I had driven to their house on Glenwood Drive directly from a meeting at Janet's office where we had spent the afternoon going through the final documents, the affidavits from Patricia and from Diane at Hargrove Associates, and the draft of the complaint we were preparing to file with the Ohio Attorney General's Elder Abuse Unit. I knew the number. I had been carrying it for weeks. $83,620, 11 years. Cheryl made soup that night, a white bean and kale soup she had made before, the same recipe, and she brought it out in the blue enamel pot that had been my grandmother's, the pot she kept in the upper cabinet above the refrigerator, the one you had to stand on your toes to reach. Cheryl had that pot now. She had had it since the house was sold, or perhaps before that, and I had never said anything about it because what would I say? I watched her set it on a trivet in the center of the table and ladle soup into bowls, and I thought about my grandmother's hands on that same pot, filling it at the kitchen tap, setting it on the front burner. My father talked about the neighbor and the documentary and his back. Cheryl refilled his water glass. The soup was good, I ate it. At some point, my father said something and Cheryl responded, and there was a pause. The kind of pause that happens in a dinner conversation when one thread has run out and no one has picked up another yet. And Cheryl looked at me across the table and she said, "You're very quiet tonight, Nora. Is everything all right?" I looked at the blue pot in the center of the table. I said, "I am fine, just tired, a work thing." She said, "Don't work too hard." My father said, "She never could help it," and he smiled at me the way he does, and I smiled back, and the conversation moved on. I drove home with the windows down even though it was cool. I took the long way down Manning Avenue past the food pantry, past where the Antlers restaurant used to be before it closed in 2015, past the neighborhood where my grandmother grew up before she married Carl and moved to Elm Ridge. I was not looking for anything. I needed the air and the movement and the ordinary streetlights of Youngstown going past in the dark. Janet filed the complaint with the Ohio Attorney General's office the following Monday. We had delivered everything: the notebook, the bank records, the forensic accounting from Hargrove Associates, the documentation of the storage unit lease and the credit card, the connection to the Patricia Ann Dunmore account. An investigator named Marcus Webb was assigned to the case within the week. He is a methodical man, early 40s, with the particular quality of stillness that I recognize in people who have sat across from a great deal of human dishonesty and have learned not to let it surprise them. He asked me thorough questions and I answered them precisely, and at the end of our first meeting, he looked at the notebook for a long time before closing it. "I have not told my father yet. I know this is the part that is hardest for people to understand. He is my father. He is living with this woman. He deserves to know. All of that is true. But Janet and I have discussed it carefully, and the conversation with my father has to happen at the right time, which means after the formal investigation has enough standing that he cannot be persuaded to dismiss what I am telling him, and before anything becomes public in a way that reaches him through someone else. We are not there yet. We are very close. In the meantime, I have sat at his table and eaten his wife's food and said nothing, which is the hardest thing I have ever done in a life that has had some hard things in it. I am not angry. This surprises me sometimes. I thought I would be angry. What I am is something quieter than that, a low, constant pressure behind my breastbone that has been there since the night I sat at my kitchen table and read the last page of the ledger and understood the full shape of what had been done. It is not anger. It is closer to grief, if grief had a second face that looked a great deal like patience. My grandmother kept a garden. She labeled everything. She put things away so that the people who came after her could find them. She kept a pot of soup on the stove and she gave the surplus tomatoes to her neighbors, and she paid off her house in 17 years on a salary that would not look like much to most people, and she did all of it without complaint or performance. She was a private woman and a careful one, and she lived her whole life in Youngstown, Ohio. And she died in March of 2016 in a hospital room that smelled like floor cleaner, with my father beside her and me 40 minutes away on a plane and Cheryl in the waiting room. The storage unit on Meridian Road is still technically open, still in my grandmother's name, though I have notified Sure Store that I am the authorized representative for the estate and no further charges should be processed. The 14 boxes are in my spare bedroom. I have been through them all now carefully over the past several months, item by item. The mason jars with the masking tape labels long faded. The needle packets organized by size. Carl's letters from overseas, which I have still not read and which I do not know if I will. The photograph is on my windowsill, the young woman in front of the car laughing at something outside the frame, 20 years old, everything still ahead of her. The pale green notebook is on my kitchen counter. I moved it there this morning from the dining room table where I had left it last night after I went through it one final time, the way you read something you are going to have to carry for a long time, slowly and all the way to the end. Cheryl's handwriting in its careful columns, 11 years of transfers, $83,620. On the cover in my grandmother's small upright print, the word household. She labeled it, she did not destroy it. She put it in a place where someone who came looking would find it. I found it, Grandma, all of it, every page. And the next step has already begun. Have you ever found something that rewrote the history you thought you already understood? Something that changed what you knew about a person you had trusted for years? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time because what happens next is the part I've been building toward this whole time. Expanded SCENESINTRWOVEN into full draft. There is a specific quality to the way Cheryl moves through a kitchen that I have been watching for 20 years without naming. She never wastes emotion. Every time she goes from the counter to the stove, she brings something with her. Every time she opens a cabinet, she closes it with her hip while her hands are already doing the next thing. It is efficient in the way that certain people are efficient, the kind of efficiency that is also a statement that says, I know this space better than you do. I belong here more completely than you do. My grandmother moved the same way in her own kitchen, and I used to think that was just what women of a certain generation looked like in a kitchen, capable and unhurried and never wasted. But my grandmother moved that way because it was her kitchen. She had been moving through it since 1969. Cheryl moves that way everywhere. I noticed it first at Christmas of 2004, 6 months after the wedding, the first holiday we all spent together. My father and Cheryl had come to my grandmother's house on Elm Ridge Road for Christmas dinner, as they would every year for the next 7 years. I was 17 and I helped my grandmother in the kitchen most of the morning, peeling potatoes and washing the good dishes and arranging the relish tray the way she liked it, the celery in the middle and the olives around the outside, and the pickled beets in the small cut glass bowl that had been Carl's mother's. When Cheryl arrived, she came into the kitchen and my grandmother put her to work without ceremony, which was how my grandmother welcomed people, by giving them something useful to do, and Cheryl moved right into it, located the correct drawer for the serving spoons without asking, found the dish towels on the first try, knew to check the oven temperature without being told. Afterward, when everyone was in the living room, I helped my grandmother with the dishes, and she said, she knows her way around a kitchen. And I said, yes, and my grandmother said nothing else, just kept washing. I have thought about that moment many times since April. My grandmother was not a suspicious woman. She was not someone who looked for bad intentions in people. She had lived a life that gave her reason to believe most people were doing the best they could with what they had. Which was a generous reading of the world and one that I think she held genuinely, not because she had not been disappointed, but because disappointment had not made her bitter. She was matter-of-fact about hard things. She talked about Carl's death matter-of-factly. She talked about the years when money was very tight matter-of-factly. She talked about the neighborhood changing and the old neighbors moving away and the steel plant closing and the slow diminishment of the city she had lived in her whole life. All of it matter-of-fact. None of it dramatic because she was not a dramatic woman. But she labeled the notebook, and she did not tell my father about the storage unit because if she had told him, he would have mentioned it before January of 2023. She kept the storage unit going with her own money, or money she believed was hers, from 2009 until she died in 2016, and then the renewal went on Cheryl's credit card, the one in the name of an account I could not trace to anyone in my family, and I have to believe that Cheryl did not know the notebook was in there. I have to believe that because the alternative that she knew and left it there anyway is a kind of confidence I find difficult to account for. Unless she did know, unless she left it there because she believed, as she had always believed, that no one was going to look. My grandmother was 81 years old when she died. She had been declining slowly for 5 years, since the fall in the backyard in 2011, and the decline was more of the mind than the body in those last 2 years. Not dramatically, not the kind of decline that becomes a medical emergency, but the ordinary slow softening that happens to some people in their late 70s, where the present becomes a little harder to hold and the past becomes a little more vivid. She still knew who I was every time I called or visited. She still asked about my work, remembered which cases I had mentioned, inquired about specific people by name. She still made her soup and kept her garden through the summer of 2014, though she needed help with the heavier work by then. But she was not the woman she had been at 60, and whatever she knew or suspected or understood about the money, I do not think she had the resources to act on it by the end. I think she did what she could. She labeled the box. My father does not know this story yet. I want to be very precise about that because I know some of you are going to wonder. He does not know because I have not told him, and I have not told him because the telling has to be done correctly with the right documents in the right order and with Janet there, and at a moment when my father is steady enough to hear it. He has a heart condition. He is not a young man. The way this conversation happens matters in ways that are not just emotional. Janet has thought about it carefully, and so have I, and we have a plan for how it goes. And we are waiting for the right moment, and that moment is coming. What I do know is that my father loved his mother. He was attentive to her in the ways that a working man with a long commute and a heart condition can be attentive, which is to say, he was present when he could be, and he trusted Cheryl to manage what he could not. He trusted her because she was capable and because she was there, and because the alternative to trusting her was to acknowledge that the care of his aging mother was beyond his own capacity to supervise, which is a hard thing for a son to acknowledge, even a good son, even one who loves his mother. I do not blame my father. I have said this to Janet and I will say it again here. I do not blame him. He was doing what people do when they are tired and they trust someone and they cannot be in two places at once. Cheryl knew all of that, she had known it from the beginning, and she used it. That is the thing that lives behind my sternum, that low constant pressure I cannot quite name. Not the money, though the money is real and the money matters and I intend to see every dollar of it accounted for. It is the use of it. The use of my father's trust and my grandmother's dependency and my own absence. All of it used efficiently without waste, the way Cheryl moves through a kitchen. I went back to SureStore 2 weeks after I had cleared out the unit, just to close the account properly and confirm that the auto-renewal had been canceled. Kim was at the desk again, the same matter-of-fact woman with the short hair and the reading glasses on a chain. She pulled up the account and confirmed everything was in order and asked if there was anything else I needed. I said no and I thanked her and I started to leave, and then I turned back and I said, "How long has this unit been here exactly?" And she looked at the screen and she said the lease had started in February of 2009. February, 2 years before my grandmother fell in the backyard and Cheryl moved in to help care for her. 2 years before the arrangement began. The household fund had started before the arrangement, before Cheryl had any official role in my grandmother's care, before anyone would have said that she had any reason to be managing my grandmother's finances at all. I drove home very slowly. I sat in my driveway for a while. The cardinal was not on the fence post, but the forsythia had leafed out by then, late spring, and it was full and green and moving slightly in the breeze, and I watched it move and I thought about February of 2009. My grandmother would have been 67. She was still well. She still drove herself to the grocery store and the church and the food pantry. She was still gardening. She was 5 years from the fall that would change her situation, and Cheryl had been married to my father for 4.5 years. And in February of 2009, Cheryl had opened a storage unit in my grandmother's name on Meridian Road and begun keeping a ledger. In February of 2009, my grandmother may or may not have known the unit existed. She may have signed something without fully understanding what she was signing. She may have been told it was for a good reason, for safekeeping, for organizing the excess from the house, or she may not have known at all. I do not know which, I may never know which, that is something I am learning to sit with. What I know is what the records show. What the records show is what I have given to Marcus Webb at the Attorney General's office and to Janet and to Diane at Hargrove Associates. What those records show is a pattern that lasted 11 years, that extracted $83,620 from my grandmother's finances, that was documented in a handwritten ledger kept in a storage unit that nobody was supposed to find, and that ended only when the account it was transferring to became inactive because the account holder died. I also know that when the investigation concludes, if it concludes the way the evidence suggests it will, my father is going to have to reckon with the fact that the woman who managed his mother's care and organized his mother's death and brought him coffee at the hospital on the morning his mother died had been taking money from his mother's account for 11 years. I think about that reckoning. I think about sitting at his kitchen table and putting the documents in front of him. I think about his face. I love my father. He is a tired man with a bad heart who trusted someone he should have been able to trust. None of what is coming is his fault, and I am going to have to tell him things that will break something in him that I do not know how to put back together. I will do it carefully. Janet will be there. We will sit with him for as long as it takes. That is the next step. That is the part I have been building toward. The notebook is on my kitchen counter. The photograph is on my windowsill. Outside, the forsythia is full and green, and the cardinal is somewhere in it. My grandmother's sewing cabinet is in the spare bedroom next to 14 boxes, all labeled, all exactly as she left them. The mason jar labels have faded until most of them are barely legible. The lavender sachet is on my windowsill next to the photograph. She was 20 years old in that photograph. She was laughing at something no one in the picture could see. She looked completely free. I am going to take care of it, Grandma. I am going to take care of all of it. And when it is done, I am going to plant something in a garden somewhere. I do not know yet what. something that produces more than I can use, something I can give away. There is a version of this story where I never find the notebook. I think about that version sometimes, late at night when the kitchen is quiet. In that version, the storage unit renews every February without anyone noticing, and eventually the credit card attached to it stops working. Maybe because the account it was drawing from gets closed or flagged, or simply because time catches up with it. Ensure Store sends a final notice, and there is no one to respond, and eventually the unit is cleared out, and the contents go to a donation center or a dumpster, and the pale green notebook with my grandmother's handwriting on the cover goes into a landfill somewhere outside Youngstown, and that is the end of it. In that version, Cheryl is my father's capable wife forever, the woman who managed everything, who brought coffee at the hospital, who kept the house going on Glenwood Drive and organized the medications and refilled the water glass. And everything she took is simply gone, absorbed into the past, belonging to no one who will ever ask about it. I do not live in that version, but it was very close. It was much closer than I like to think about. That morning I called Patricia at the bank. I had almost not called. I was tired from the Medina County case, and I had two other files open on my desk, and the feeling that had made me think of my grandmother's account was exactly the kind of feeling I sometimes dismiss as pattern recognition gone too far, the occupational hazard of spending too much time with numbers, where you start seeing shapes that may not be there. I had gotten up from my desk, made tea, stood at the kitchen window watching the forsythia for a while, and then sat back down and told myself, just call. If there is nothing there, you will have spent 20 minutes and confirmed that, and you can go back to the Medina file. Just call. 20 minutes turned into 2 days, turned into 6 weeks, turned into 8 months and counting. I want to tell you about one more thing that happened, because it matters and because I have not told anyone yet, not even Janet. I am going to tell you because this is the kind of story where the small, true things are the weight of it, not the large, dramatic ones. In May, between the first dinner at Glenwood Drive and the second, I drove out to the Elm Ridge neighborhood alone on a Saturday afternoon. I parked on the street in front of the house. It is different now. The new owners painted it a darker color, a sage green where it used to be white with green shutters, and they took out the covered porch and put in a small concrete stoop, which is practical but not the same. The backyard where the garden was is visible from the street if you stand at the right angle between the houses, and I stood there on the sidewalk and looked at it. There is no garden now. There is a playset, the plastic kind with the slide and the climbing wall, bright primary colors, obviously new. A family with young children. I stood there for probably 5 minutes. A woman came out of the front door, the new door, darker wood, and she looked at me the way people look when someone is standing in front of their house for no apparent reason, not hostile, just questioning. I said, I used to visit here when I was a child. My grandmother lived here. She said, oh, it's a wonderful house. I said, yes. She said, we love it. I walked back to my car. I sat there for another few minutes. I thought about the covered porch, the way the light came through it in the afternoons, the particular angle of shade it made on the front walk. I thought about sitting on that porch with my grandmother in the late summer, eating sliced peaches from the jar she had put up in August, the peaches from the backyard tree that was probably not there anymore, and talking about nothing in particular while the evening came in over the rooftops. $83,620. I thought she deserved those peaches. She deserved all of it. She earned every jar she put up and every dollar she saved and every year of stability she managed to build in a city that was losing its economic footing under her even as she was building. She deserved the full measure of what she left behind, and Cheryl took a piece of it, carefully and over time, and labeled it something else. I do not know if my grandmother was unhappy in her last years. She did not say so on our Sunday calls. She told me about the garden and the church and the things she was watching on television and the neighbor whose cat kept coming into the yard. She asked about my cases without asking for details she knew I could not share. She said she was fine. She said Cheryl was a great help. She said, don't worry about me, Nora, you have your own life to be getting on with. I said I know, Grandma. I said I would come soon. I came at Christmas. I came for a few days in the summer of 2014 and again in the summer of 2015, the last full summer before she died. I watched her in her kitchen, slower than she had been but still moving through it with that same efficiency, still knowing exactly which drawer held what, still making the soup in the blue pot and the relish tray with the olives around the outside and the beets in the cut glass bowl. She was thinner. She was quieter, she sat down more than she used to. When I left in August of 2015, she walked me to the car. She was using a cane by then, a plain aluminum one, and she stood at the end of the front walk with the cane and she looked at me for a moment before I got in. She said, "You turned out very well, Nora." She said it the way she said everything, matter-of-factly, without sentiment. I said, "Thank you." She said, "You know how to look at things and see them. That is a rare thing. Not everyone can do that." I said, "Thank you again." I got in the car, I drove away, and I looked in the rearview mirror, and she was still standing at the end of the walk watching me go, and I thought, I should visit more. I should call more often. I should be here more. Ozzy died 7 months later. I think she knew how to look at things, and she knew what she was looking at, and she put it in a box and labeled it in her own hand and put it somewhere she thought might eventually be found. She told me I knew how to look. And then she died, and it took me 8 years to start looking, and when I started, I found everything she left for me to find. I finished the last page of the ledger at 1 in the morning. I closed it, I set it on the table, and I sat in my quiet kitchen and I thought about that last visit and the cane and the front walk and the way she had said, "You know how to look at things and see them." She was right, I do. Tomorrow, the next step. Let me tell you about the Sunday calls. Every Sunday from the time I moved to Columbus in 2013 until she died in March of 2016, I called my grandmother at 9 in the morning. This was her preference. She was up by 7 and had already had her breakfast and her second cup of coffee by 9, and that was when she was most herself, she said, most awake, before the day had a chance to tire her out. I called her cell phone, a basic flip phone she had learned to use because my father had insisted, though she still sometimes answered it holding it the wrong way and had to be told to turn it around. Our calls lasted between 20 and 35 minutes. She did not like long phone calls. She said long calls meant somebody had too much time on their hands. We covered her health, my work in broad strokes, the weather in Youngstown, which she discussed with the same detailed attention she gave to everything in her immediate environment, the neighbor situations which were ongoing and complex and which she narrated with a dry humor that I loved, and whatever she was watching on television. She liked procedural dramas and cooking competitions, and one show about people renovating historic houses that she watched every week without fail and discussed, as if the homeowners were people she knew personally. In 2014 and 2015, the calls changed slightly. Not dramatically, not in a way I could have pointed to at the time and called a change, but looking back, I can see it. She started answering more slowly, as if the phone had rung for longer before she got to it. She talked about being tired more often, which she had not done before because she was not a woman who mentioned fatigue as a rule. Twice in 2015, she asked me something she had already asked the previous week, not confused exactly, more as if the previous week had gone a little soft at the edges. And once in October of 2015, she said something at the end of a call that she had not said before. She said, "Make sure you know where to look, Nora." I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Oh, never mind, I am just talking, you drive safe." I have thought about that moment many times. I thought about it the night I sat at my kitchen table and read the last page of the ledger. Make sure you know where to look. She knew she was going. She could feel the edges softening. And she was trying to say something that she had not said directly because she was not a woman who said things directly when she was not certain, and she was not certain. She was only perhaps afraid. I wish I had asked more questions in October of 2015. I wish I had said, "Where should I look, Grandma? What are you telling me?" But I was 30 and tired, and I said, "I will, you take care of yourself," and she said, "I always do." And that was the last call before the hospital stay in November, and then the calls became briefer and more fragmented, and then they stopped because she died in March and I was 40 minutes late. I am not punishing myself for any of this. I want to be clear about that because I think it would be easy to hear this story as a story about what I should have done differently, and it is not that story. I was doing what I could do from where I was. I called every Sunday. I visited when I could. I did not know what I did not know. The information was hidden deliberately and carefully by someone who had every reason to keep it hidden and who had correctly assessed that no one in my immediate family was looking at the right documents. None of that is on me. I have told myself that many times, and I believe it most of the time. The part I am still working on is simpler than the guilt. The part I am still working on is the grief of it. The idea that she was alone in that house with someone who was taking from her and that she may have known and could not say so clearly, and she found the only way she could to leave a record, and it took 8 years for anyone to follow it. She deserved better. She deserved someone looking sooner. I am looking now. Janet and I spoke this morning. The investigation is moving. Marcus Webb has requested additional documents from the financial institutions and has conducted a preliminary interview with one of Cheryl's former colleagues, the relevance of which he did not explain to me and which I will not speculate about. The process has its own pace, which is slower than I would like and faster than I feared, and I am learning to work alongside it rather than in front of it. This is not the easiest thing for someone like me, someone who is accustomed to being the one who pulls the thread, but it is not my case to run. My job now is to be a clear and accurate witness and to wait. I am good at waiting, I have had practice. The summer I was 12, I waited 3 weeks to ask my grandmother a question I was afraid of. I wanted to know if she was scared when Carl died. Not afraid of death in general, but specifically in that moment when the call came when she knew. I had been thinking about it since a friend's father had died in the spring, and she had come to school looking like something had happened to the inside of her face, and I could not stop thinking about what my grandmother's face must have looked like on that day in 1990 when she found out. I waited 3 weeks because I was not sure if the question was allowed. Some things you could ask my grandmother and some things you could not because she would refuse to answer, but because you could feel when you were close to something private. Some interior room she did not open the door to, and the question of Carl seemed like it might be in one of those rooms. So I waited. And finally, one evening at the end of summer, sitting on the covered porch with the last of the daylight going, I asked. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the street. A car went by, somebody's kids riding bikes behind it. She said, yes, I was scared. She said it like it was a simple fact, a piece of information she was confirming, not something she was confiding. I said, what did you do? And she said, I kept going. There is not much else you can do. She kept going. That was her whole philosophy, stated plainly at the end of a summer evening with the light going and the kids biking down the street. You keep going. There is not much else you can do. I kept going after she died. I grieved and I went back to Columbus and then I moved to Akron and I called my father every week and had dinner with him and Cheryl and I kept going through all of it, the cases and the Sunday calls and the monthly dinners and the years passing, and then in April I found the storage unit and in April I found the notebook and I kept going through that too. I made the calls, I drove to Janet's office, I laid the documents out, I sat at Glenwood Drive and ate the white bean soup from my grandmother's pot and said I was fine, just tired, a work thing. I am still going. The notebook is on my kitchen counter. The eucalyptus sachet is on my windowsill and the photograph of my grandmother at 20 years old is next to it, propped against the window frame. She is laughing at something I cannot see. She looks completely unguarded, completely herself before the years that would follow. Before Carl and the steel plant and the house on Elm Ridge Road and the garden and the fall in the backyard and the last 4 years and the hospital room in March. Before any of it, just a young woman laughing. I look at that photograph every morning when I make my tea. I look at it and I think you kept going, all of it, every bit of it, you kept going. So will I. And one more thing, before I close this out, before we get to what happens next. There was a moment at the April dinner, the first one after I found the notebook, that I have not described yet. We were finishing the meal, my father and Cheryl, and Cheryl got up to clear the plates and she picked up the blue enamel pot from the center of the table and she carried it toward the kitchen, and as she passed behind my chair she said, your grandmother would have liked this soup, I think. She made something similar. And she kept walking into the kitchen with the pot in her hands. I did not look up from the table. I picked up my fork and set it down. I thought, yes, she would have, she made it in that pot, which you know because you were there. My father said she did actually, didn't she? And he smiled at me, that apologetic, private smile, and I said yes, she did. And Cheryl called from the kitchen, does anyone want coffee? I said no thank you. My father said yes. And Cheryl put the pot in the sink and ran water into it and began making coffee, and the conversation moved on, and I sat at the table with my hands in my lap and the pressure behind my sternum that has not left me since October, and I thought, tomorrow, not yet. Tomorrow,